everyone. So today what we're going to do is we are going to read Act 2, Scenes 1 and 2. And we're going to see the dramatic replay of the death of King Duncan. Now, just as a little review, all throughout Act 1, what we saw was a man in internal conflict. Macbeth, who starts the play as a loyal and brave thane and warrior, has been thrown into a moral state of confusion when the witches present him with the possibility that he might get to be king someday. Of course, this is something that is an interesting thing for him, something he never thought of before. And he's shaken when he first has thoughts of killing the king because this goes against everything that is him. However, he goes back and forth and fluctuates in this scene. And his wife has already determined that she is going to tell him what he needs to know in order to get him to do it. We witnessed a soliloquy in which Macbeth carefully weighed the pros and cons of killing the king and came to the conclusion at the end of that soliloquy that it wasn't worth it. He doesn't have enough reasons to do it, and he decided he wasn't going to do it. And then in came his wife, who convinced him by challenging his manhood and implying that she would love him even more if he were to do this act. And at the end of that scene, he's decided he's going to do it. He ends the scene by saying, "Stars, hide your fires. Let not light see my black and deep desires." He wants the stars to turn their lights off so that no one can see what is really in his black heart. So that's pretty dramatic stuff. When the curtain opens up on Act 2, we open up to Banquo and his son Fleance. Now, you may remember Banquo. We saw him early in the play. He's a friend and a colleague of Macbeth's. We can perhaps assume that he is a thane or a high-ranking man in the kingdom. And he is also at Macbeth's castle. And he is walking with his son Fleance. Now, Fleance is of particular importance in this play because of the witch's prophecy. If you will remember, the witches prophesied that Banquo will get kings, though that he will be none. By that they meant his descendants will be king, but he personally will not be. So that makes us think that, maybe Fleance is on the agenda too. As the scene opens up, there's just some small talk between father and son. Banquo says, "How goes the night, boy?" And Fleance says, "The moon is down. I have not heard the clock." Banquo says, "And she goes down at 12. I take 'tis later, sir." So just some small talk about what time it is. And it looks like it's about midnight, which makes sense because all evil things seem to happen at midnight in literature, right? Banquo hands his sword to his son and says, "Hold my sword." And then he looks up in the sky and says, "There's husbandry in heaven. Their candles are all out." Take thee that too. "A heavy summons lies like lead upon me, and yet I would not sleep. Merciful powers restrain in me the cursed thoughts that nature gives way to in repose." Most of what he said there, he was indicating that he's really tired, but he just doesn't feel like he can sleep. Something's bothering him. But the first part is interesting because he says, "There's husbandry in heaven, the candles are all out." If you say the candles are out in heaven, I think what he's saying is it's a very black, dark night. There's no stars out in the sky, which is interesting when you consider what Macbeth said in the previous scene about stars hiding their fires. At this point, Banquo hears a noise and he takes his sword from his son and says, "Give me my sword." "Who's there?" Macbeth comes in and says, "A friend." And Banquo says, "Oh, what? Sir, not yet at rest? The king's abed. He hath been in unusual pleasure and sent forth great largesse to your offices. This diamond he greets your wife withal by the name of most kind hostess, and shut up in measureless content." So Banquo expresses surprise that Macbeth is not yet asleep. He says the king has gone to bed a long time ago. He seems to be doing really well. He was in a really good mood. He says that he has sent forth great largesse to Macbeth's offices. Now, back in that time period, kings often rewarded their thanes by giving them money if they did a really great job in battle. So apparently Macbeth has been rewarded even more by getting some money, and the king has also sent a diamond ring as a gift of honor to his wife, Lady Macbeth. And all of these things make Macbeth's thoughts even worse because the king is rewarding him over and over again. Macbeth says, being unprepared, our will became the servant to defect which else should free have wrought. I think by that, what he means basically is if I had known he was coming, I could have prepared more, we would have made things even nicer. Banquo says, all's well. And then the conversation turns, and Banquo says to him, I dreamt last night of the three weird sisters. To you they have showed some truth. Macbeth says, I think not of them. Yet when we would entreat an hour to serve, we would spend it in some words upon that business, if he would grant the time. I think it's funny that Macbeth acts like he doesn't even think of that anymore. I forgot all about it. But he does say, maybe when you have a few moments, we can sit and talk about that more. Banquo says, at your kindest leisure. And then Macbeth says something very interesting. He says to his friend, if you shall cleave to my consent when 'tis, it shall make honor for you. So to cleave is to cling or to stick to something. So really what he said there is if you stick to my consent when 'tis, when the time is right, it will make honor for you. That sounds almost like a bribe, doesn't it? If you stay with me when the time is right, I'll make sure that you get honor, that you will work out okay. Interestingly enough, Banquo seems instantly suspicious because he says, so I lose none in seeking to augment it, but still keep my bosom franchised and allegiance clear, I shall be counseled. He seems to say to his friend, well, as long as I don't lose any honor in seeking to augment or gain more, that will be fine. Macbeth says, good repose the while, and Banquo says, thanks, sir, the like to you. And those two leave. At this point, Macbeth calls or beckons a servant that is nearby, and he says to the servant, go bid thy mistress when my drink is ready, she strike upon the bell. Go get thee to bed. So he tells the servant, go tell thy mistress, Lady Macbeth, when my drink is ready to ring the bell, and I'll know it's ready. You can go to bed after that. Now, the bell is not really a signal that his drink is ready. The bell is the signal worked out between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth to indicate that the guards are drunk, they're passed out, and the time is right to go kill the king. After the servant leaves, Macbeth has an interesting moment. This is the first of many that show that Macbeth is not the kind of man who can just engage in murder and just walk away unscathed. In the moments before he's waiting for the signal to go and kill the king, he hallucinates. He sees things that aren't there, and what he sees is a dagger. So he probably looks at it again and says, is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle toward my hand? Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. So he tries to reach for it and grab it, but it's not really there. It must be, he looks at it and he says it's not there, and then he says, art thou not fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain? Now at this point, he must look away and look back, and it's still there, because he says, I see thee yet, in form as palpable as that which now I draw. He draws his own dagger and holds it out as comparison. And the dagger, the invisible dagger, or the hallucination, looks just like his own dagger. Thou marshallest me the way that I was going, and such an instrument I was to use. Mine eyes are made the fools of other senses, or else worth the while the rest. He must look away again, and when he looks back where the dagger is, he says, I see thee still, and on thy blade and dudgeon gouts of blood, which was not so before. So when he looks away and he looks back at it, now the dagger is covered in blood. He says, there's no such thing. It's the bloody business which informs thus to mine eyes. So he tries to convince himself that it's not really there. This is just in his mind. Now o'er the one-half world nature seems dead, and wicked dreams abuse the carton sleep. Witchcraft celebrates pale Hecate's offerings, and withered murder alarmed by its sentinel, the wolf, whose howl has watched thus with stealthy pace, with Tarquin's ravishing strides towards his design, moves like a ghost. O thou sure and firm set earth, hear not my steps, which way they walk, for fear thy very stones prate of thy whereabouts and take the present horror from the time which now suits with it. Whilst I threat, he lives, words to the heat of deeds too cold breath gives. At this point, the bell rings, and Macbeth says, I go, and it's done. The bell invites me. Hear it not, Duncan, for it is a knell that summons thee to heaven or to hell. So in that dramatic moment, he goes off. But that hallucination was important. It was telling. It tells us that Macbeth is having trouble with this. His guilty conscience is already taking the form of a hallucination, a dagger. Scene 2 cuts to Lady Macbeth, his wife, who was in their bedchamber. And although she seemed cool as a cucumber in the early scenes when we saw her, we see she is not immune to nerves because she's panicking. She's walking back and forth. She's very nervous. Every time there's a sound, she's jumpy. She starts by saying, that which hath made them drunk hath made me bold. What hath quenched them hath given me fire. So apparently she's been drinking too, because that which has knocked the guards out has given her, she says, strength and courage. But then there's a noise, and she jumps and says, hark, peace! Oh, it was the owl that shrieked, the fatal bellman, which gives the sternest good night. So she heard a noise and she jumped and then realized it was just an owl. She says, he's about it, meaning her husband has gone to do it. The doors are open and the surfeited grooms do mock their charge with snores. I've drunk their possets, that death and nature do contend about them, whether they live or die. Now, whenever you hear them talk about the grooms, they're talking about the chamberlains or those guards outside the chamber. So she reasons that she's gotten them so drunk that they almost look like they're dead. They're passed out. They are out. So she feels that you could do anything and they wouldn't wake up. At that point, she hears her husband's voice. She doesn't see him, but she hears him say this, who's there? What? Ho? And she jumps again and she says, alack, I am afraid they have awaked and 'tis not done. The attempt and not the deed confounds us. Hark, I laid their daggers ready. He could not miss 'em. Had he not resembled my father as he slept, I had done it. It's a really interesting line, because what she appears to be saying is that she got the guards drunk and she stood over the sleeping Duncan. She was watching him sleep, which is creepy enough. She thought about killing him herself, right? But then she said he looked like her father as he was sleeping, and so she couldn't do it. Really interesting thing to say, especially because in the previous act, she told her husband that she was so sure about this that she could kill their own child to get this done. So it's a really bizarre line. Enter her husband. He walks into their bedchamber, and you know what? He's still carrying the daggers in his hands, and he's shaken like a leaf. He is a hot mess. He comes walking in, and she says, my husband? And he says, I've done the deed. Didst thou not hear a noise? She says, I heard the owl scream and the crickets cry. Did not you speak? When? Now, as I descended? I. Hark, who lies in the second chamber? He says, who is sleeping in the second bedroom? And Lady Macbeth says, Donalbain. Now, Donalbain is the king's younger son. The king has two sons at this time, Malcolm, the elder one, who will be his successor, and Donalbain, the younger one. So Lady Macbeth says, yeah, there's Donalbain. There's someone in that bedroom. It's Donalbain. Macbeth apparently must look at his hands, carrying the daggers, and he says, this is a sorry sight. She says, a foolish thought to say a sorry sight. Her husband just seems like he's in shock. He is rambling, and this is what he's saying. There's one did laugh in his sleep, and one cried, murder, that they did wake each other. I stood and I heard them, but they did say their prayers and address them again to sleep. Lady Macbeth says, there are two lodged together. Macbeth says, one cried, God bless us, and amen the other, as they had seen me with these hangman hands, listening their fear. I could not say amen when they did say, God bless us. Now, let me just tell you what he's rambling about. In his mind, he said, I was walking past their bedrooms, the doors were closed, and all of a sudden, he heard someone asleep in one of the bedrooms say, murder! I'm sure he froze in his steps, thinking he was discovered. And then the two people that are in the bedroom talk a little bit. They say their prayers and they go back to sleep. And when they said amen, Macbeth tried to say amen too, and he couldn't do it. Lady Macbeth says, "Consider it not so deeply." And he says, "But wherefore could I not pronounce amen? I had most need of blessing, and amen stuck in my throat." She says, "Those deeds must not be thought of after these ways. It will make us mad." Interesting, she says that. So she goes, "Don't think about that. It's going to drive you crazy." But he is really troubled and bothered by the fact that he tried to say amen in that moment and he couldn't do it. It stuck right in his throat. He continues on rambling, and this is what he's saying now. "Methought I heard a voice cry, 'Sleep no more. Macbeth doth murder sleep. The innocent sleep, sleep that knits up the raveled sleeve of care, the death of each day's life, sore labor's bath, the balm of hurt minds, great nature's second course, chief nourisher in life's feast.'" He's kind of rambling, and his wife says, "What do you mean?" And he says, "Still, it cried, 'Sleep no more,' to all the house. Glamis hath murdered sleep, and therefore Carter shall sleep no more. Macbeth shall sleep no more." All right, let me explain this a little bit. This is interesting. Now, in the previous scene, he was hallucinating. His guilty conscience made him see a dagger that was not there. Now, in the moments after he killed the king, he's hearing voices in his head. And the voices say, "Glamis hath murdered sleep, and therefore Carter shall sleep no more. Macbeth shall sleep no more." Now, think this out a little bit. If you murdered the king, you got the guards drunk outside his bedchamber, you went in and murdered the king in his sleep, and then you became king, you think you'd get a good night's sleep? Wouldn't you be worried that maybe somebody would do the same thing to you? I mean, after all, I don't think you're going to trust the guards outside the door. You know what can happen. You wrote the book on that play. And what happens to people when they are deprived of sleep for extended periods of time? They start to go insane. His wife tries to calm him. She says, "Who was it that thus cried? What worthy thing, you do unbend your noble strength to think so brain sickly of things. Go, get some water and wash this filthy witness from your hand. Why did you bring these daggers from the place? They must lie there. Go, carry them and smear the sleepy grooms with blood." So once again, she's on damage control. She's like, "What are you doing? No, this was all in your head. Why do you have the daggers with you? You were supposed to leave them there. Go back, smear the grooms with blood, do what stick with the plan." But Macbeth looks at his hands and he's shaking and he says, "I'll go no more. I'm afraid to think what I've done. Look on it again, I dare not." He can't go. So she takes the daggers from him and finishes the job. She says, "Infirm of purpose, give me the daggers. The sleeping and the dead are but as pictures. 'Tis the eye of childhood that fears a painted devil. If he do bleed, I'll gild the faces of the grooms withal, for it must seem their fault." She exits with the daggers. She goes to finish the job that he could not do. While she's gone, Macbeth hears a knocking and he jumps. And he says, "Whence is it with that knocking? How is it with me that every noise appalls me?" And then he looks down at his hands again. Now we can somewhat assume that he's moving to a basin where he's going to wash his hands. But before he does, he looks at them covered in blood and he says, "What hands are here? Oh, they pluck out mine eyes. Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? No, this, my hand, will rather the multitudinous seeds in Cardine, making the green one red." In that line, he creates a powerful image where he imagines that if he were to stick his hands in the green sea, there's so much blood on them it would turn it all red. Now we know literally that can't happen, but the blood is starting to take on symbolic importance. As you may guess, it's starting to symbolize his own guilt. And he feels like it's so deep that if he were to put his hands in the ocean, the whole ocean would turn red. Remember, he said that because moments later, his wife comes in. Her hands are all covered in blood now too, because she just went to smear the grooms with blood. She says this, "My hands are of your color, but I shame to wear a heart so white." Presumably she's starting to wash her hands and she says, I hear a knocking at the south entry. Retire we to our chamber. A little water clears us of this deed. How easy it is then. Your constancy hath left you unattended. So note the interesting contrast and juxtaposition between their reactions to the blood. Macbeth says, my blood, there's so much blood on my hands, if I put it in the green sea, it'd turn it red. And his wife says, look, a little water and it's all gone. I'm not crying about it. See how easy it is? She then tries to get him in control, and she says, hark, more knocking. Get on your nightgown, lest occasion call us and show us to be watchers. Be not lost so poorly in your thoughts. So she tells him, knock it off. You need to get your night clothes on, look like you've been asleep. Get it together. And Macbeth says, to know my deed, 'twere best not to know myself. He hears another knock at the door, and he says, wake Duncan with thy knocking. I would thou couldst. I would thou couldst means I wish you could. So he ends that note already regretting what he has done. It hasn't taken long. He's already regretting it. He's having trouble holding it together. Themes of madness pervade Shakespeare's works, and this is just another example of this. So thank you for listening today and for reading along with me. We'll see what's going to happen once the body of Duncan is discovered in the castle.